Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Module 3 and Chapter 3 in our book. And as you may have already seen if you've read ahead, or as you will see soon, this chapter really focuses in on the idea of human dignity, right? The fact that we have, um, just by being a human person, this intrinsic, innate value and worth that isn't really dependent on any other factor. Um, and if you know something about Catholic moral teaching or natural law theory, you'll know that now we are getting, as I kind of alluded to in the last module, in this module, we're getting to a clear connection with a more traditional natural law account of Catholic morality, right? Because in past years when I've taught just a really straight natural law theory approach, the very first thing that you begin with in working out Catholic ethics or natural law ethics is you begin with the intrinsic dignity of the human person, right? And so one of the things we will talk about as we continue to go through the class and on the weekend, as we look at other ethical systems, you have to start your moral system, your any sort of philosophical system, on some fundamental claims, right? You have to have some presuppositions that you simply accept as a given. There's no way to actually prove absolutely everything, every foundation of any system of thought, right? As finite beings, that's not how we exist, right? And that's something that Waddell talks about in the chapter, is that as finite contingent beings, we are always dependent on something else. We are obviously dependent on God, sort of in an ultimate sense, for our very existence, which we will talk about. But in the intellectual life, or even in our reasoning, we are ultimately dependent as well. We can't sort of prove our own foundations, if you will. We have to start with some fundamental truths that we simply accept. And the fundamental truth that everything else is built off of in Catholic morality or in natural law theory is this fundamental truth of the dignity of the human person, right? And so, starting with that, um, right, then we build out all the specific rules about how we act and how we shouldn't act. And I think, as you hopefully see, and as Waddell, I think, explains pretty well, there really is a connection here with the more narrative approach that we've seen in the first couple of chapters, right? Because the very opening of the biblical narrative, of the Christian narrative, is, of course, the account of creation in the book of Genesis, right? And that is where we get much of the foundation of this idea of human dignity, right? That God makes man and woman in his own image, right? That we are made in the image of God. That means that we have um, an intrinsic value and worth um, because we are connected with, we are an expression of, an image of God Himself, right? So that there's not a conflict between the sort of narrative approach that he's been advocating for so far and a more traditional, systematic, natural law approach, right? So once we accept this idea that there is an intrinsic dignity to each human person, how do we start building up from there, right? And that's one of the things that we will be working out as we go through the book and as we go through the course. Um, this leads us to some of the other sort of fundamental maxims or rules of natural law theory, which we will get to as we go along in Waddell, but I will just go ahead and also spell out here. Um, one of them is simply the statement that you never intentionally harm an innocent human person, right? So we'll talk about this more as we go along, but um, this idea tries to kind of flesh out a little more this idea of human dignity, right? Because one of the consequences of valuing each human person is that we can never intentionally harm them. Um, right? And so we'll talk about this. Each word in that statement is important. Never intentionally harm an innocent human person, right? So sometimes we harm people unintentionally. That's not an immoral act, at least in a straightforward sense. It may be if you ought to have been more careful, but then the immoral act is the carelessness more than the accidental act that followed from it. Um, Similarly, right, you never intentionally harm an innocent person, right? So this means that in natural law theory and Catholic morality, you can in fact use force that is harmful to a person if they aren't innocent, right? So if someone is attacking me and trying to kill me, I can in fact use force that would harm them in order to stop that unjust attack, right? And we will talk about that more as we get into later chapters and where there'll be a discussion of just war theory, right? So one of the things um, to understand about natural law theory and Catholic morality is that um, a lot of these principles are very carefully and deliberately thought out and expressed, right? So in the last module, there were a number of people who brought up the Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments as a synopsis of Catholic morality, and obviously it is. Um, but one of the things we'll see in a lot of different cases is that the Ten Commandments is very helpful as a sort of concise expression of standard moral norms, right? That is standard moral rules that should guide our conduct on a day by day basis, right? You shall not steal, you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, right? These are basic guidelines, but there are going to be situations where you have to get more specific and precise, right? And so this expression, never intentionally harm an innocent person, is a more precise way of essentially saying thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. Because, in fact, natural law theory and Catholic morality does allow the use of force, and even in some cases, the use of deadly force when persons are not innocent, right? When they are actively seeking to harm others. But we will talk about that more as we go along, right? Another way of expressing the consequences of this idea of human dignity is that you never treat a person as a means to an end, right? That or in more everyday languages, you don't use people, right? And so this is going to cover the never intentionally harm an innocent person tends to come up in discussions of violence. It can come up in discussions of things like abortion or euthanasia. Um, Never use a person as a means to an end is a helpful way of thinking about the consequences of human dignity in some other areas of life. So, for example, when we think about sexual ethics, right? This obviously is even part of common everyday language, right? The language of using a person is going to be something that is criticized even by most secular thinkers or speakers, right? That one of the things, one of the bare minimums that most people in society would accept today in terms of sexual ethics is that you don't objectify another person or you don't use them merely as a means for your own benefit. Now, of course, again, as we talked about last time, um, that does often happen, right? And there are many forces in our society that, in fact, encourage that kind of behavior. But if you actually asked most people, they would say, no, you shouldn't use another person as an object, right? Now, again, there would be some debates around the details, but that is an idea that is going to be pretty widespread. Another place where this comes up is in terms of economics or business, right? And that do we treat people as a means to an end in the sense of getting our profit at the expense of another? Whether it's a customer that we overcharge or whether it's an employee that we don't treat fairly, um, those are going to be cases where human dignity is going to be an important thing to keep in mind. Um, Right. So, and that's going to follow from one of the things we'll see as we go through the book, as we go through the class, is that a lot of complex rules, when we get into details of things like in vitro fertilization or sexual ethics or economic justice, that when you boil it all down, it's going to come back to these sort of fundamental principles of upholding the dignity of every person and treating them in a way that reflects and builds on that dignity, right? So those are sort of negative ways of expressing um, the consequences of human dignity, right? Is don't violate them, don't harm them, don't use them. Um, Waddell talks a lot about the image of God, right? And one of the things, taking a more positive approach to the idea of human dignity, is that we want to sort of honor and respect and promote this good in other people, right? So we can look at it in terms of, okay, don't do these bad things. But another consequence is if other people really have this intrinsic value, and if we are called to love God fully and completely, are we not also called to love the image of God in other people? Right. And of course, this is very famously expressed by many saints. Mother Teresa would probably be maybe the first example that comes to mind for many of us, is that when she would see the poor and the dying, she would see Christ, right? And she would treat those people as she would treat God, right? Because they were the image of God, right? And so that's going to mean that we don't only not do bad things, but that we in fact work for the good of others, right? And so one of the other sort of maxims or norms of natural law theory is we ought to promote the true good of others, right? And again, this is important to kind of pay attention to the details, right? Is that we work to promote the true good of others, right? So we don't necessarily give everybody everything that they want, right? This is obviously the case for any of you who have been parents, or any of you who babysat or had younger siblings, or even reflecting on your own behavior. Um, right? It's not necessarily really good for people to always give them exactly what they ask for, what they think they want in the moment, right? That can be, in fact, harmful to them, right? And so, what we are called to do is to promote the true good of others, right? We need to do our best to discern what is really going to be to this person's true and full benefit, to help them to attain true happiness, to help them attain eudaimonia, and we act in that way. Now, of course, this can get very complicated, right? So, um, part of promoting the real good of people, at least once they're adults, is allowing them the freedom and responsibility to determine the own course of their lives. So we aren't going to want to patronize people to make choices for them that we think are for their benefit, because that can, in fact, work against their true good, that you are minimizing and denying their true agency. So that's going to be complicated, right? And there's also going to be cases where it can be remarkably difficult to know what is actually going to be to someone's true good. Um, if somebody is in an end of life scenario, right, and we are trying to uh, control severe pain through palliative medications, how do we balance the good of extending biological life with the good of mitigating pain, right? And can we give a drug that will help control their pain, but might increase the chances of an earlier death, right? These are going to be complicated issues in terms of sorting out what is really um, someone's true good, right? And as we're going to talk about in coming chapters, this is a place where prudence becomes kind of crucial, right? Prudence is a virtue we will talk about more later on, of thinking about how to apply principles to specific situations, to specific circumstances and details. And so there's going to be a whole lot of uh, work in many cases in figuring that out, right? And so this is also, again, in terms of trying to fleshing out our understanding of Catholic moral teaching and moral debates. This is where we get references to prudential judgments, right? So that you can have two people who are really both seeking the true good of a person, but who might disagree about the specific steps or actions that will help promote that true good, right? So again, in the example of parenting, um, there are obviously situations where a father and a mother both really desire the true good of a child, but may have different views on how to promote that true good in a particular situation, right? And so those same kinds of things can also happen in other uh, contexts, right, outside of the family. So again, going back to the previous chapters, though, right, the goal here, what we should all agree on, is that we ought to work to promote the true good, the true happiness everyone to the best of our ability, right? That's what we ought have to agree on. And again, I think this Waddell does a nice job of connecting this. Um, Shoot, hold on.